for coming today. We have a real treat today with Niels Christian's talk. Niels has run an incredibly productive program of research during Corona. As many of you will know, because Niels is a very familiar face here, he has been an IAS fellow for the last little while on a project looking at why humans make music. Previous to, he did work at Aarhus, then went to Ohio State University, and then University of Western Australia.
Western Sydney.
Western Sydney, yeah. So sorry. So you've really had quite a global education and instructional training and whatnot. And of course, I think for many people it's an incredibly interesting and specific topic, and the IMC was really, really delighted to fund some of the cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary work that Niels has presented here, and we're very excited to hear your talk today. Do you have any preferences about questions during or after or anything like that?
I mean, it seems like a small crowd, so if you have any clarifying questions, just feel free to.
Super. Yeah. Thank you so much, Niels, for coming up. We're looking forward to your talk now.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Christine. So yeah, I'll be talking a bit about my. Actually, I got 2 seed funding grants over the last 2 years or so that have looked at different aspects of the role of the role of music during the lockdowns. Since I have a whole seminar, I'll kind of review the whole area of research that has come about during this time. So it's not only those specific projects that you might have seen in the seed funding announcements, but it's kind of a broader overview today. And then I'll maybe I have a small caveat, because this is very, very close to what I presented at my IAS seminar a few weeks ago, and also what I presented at other places. I gave a keynote at the Social Bridges conference in January that are also very similar to this. So if any of you have seen any of that, you're gonna hear a lot of repetition, so feel free to leave the room and come back for the discussion if you want. But yeah, let's jump into it. So one of the hottest topics at the moment in the cognitive science of music is this debate about what the adaptive functions of music are. So why do we have music? Why do we waste so many resources and so much time on learning to play and understand music? And there were 2 target articles in Behavioral and Brain Sciences recently who argued for 2 different theories. One is a social bonding theory, so that the role of music is to make you feel like part of something, and the other part is a credible signaling theory, according to which you signal the coalition of your own group, or you signal the attention of yourself towards your offspring and so on. And those are kind of going in different directions, and only 2 of these theories. But what's interesting is that Henk and Honing in Amsterdam made this interesting interview with all the people who wrote these 40 commentaries afterwards, saying, okay, which of these 2 theories do you most agree with? And as you can see, people don't tend to agree with either one or the other. They tend to agree a little bit with one and a little bit with the other. So it's really an ongoing discussion what the role of music is. And Peter Keller and I also had a commentary published here where we try to kind of say, okay, what are the current theories of the origins of the adaptive functions of music? So there's this thing about group cohesion and perhaps coping. There are different theories about sexual attraction, going back to Darwin. Some people argue that you can communicate with your infants before you can speak to them. You can sing to them. There's a coalition signaling, the idea that you can better coordinate your activities if you're rowing across the sea or building something or going to war, going hunting and so on. And this idea that we maintain some of our civilizational knowledge through music, and music makes it easier to memorize these things. And of course these things lead to different types of music, and it all seems to have something to do with social music making as a way of optimizing predictive processing. And we also talk about oxytocin in this commentary, which is something that we've been working on over the last few years. But of course, if you want to understand what the role of music is, you should you should look towards the times of crisis. So when when a problem, you know, when we're faced with a problem, do we turn to music? And here, of course, the recent coronavirus pandemic is a very good place to start. It appears, and of course, you know, if I take you back to the day of the pandemic declaration, the 11th of March 2020, you remember probably many of these images, you know, shocking images of sports facilities turned into hospitals, you know, trucks driving out of North Italian cities, allegedly with dead bodies and so on, flattening the curve and so on, financial crisis, which is perhaps dwarfed by the current one, but at least at the time it seemed very serious. Of course, these kinds of sudden changes in our daily lives led to different types of mental health issues. So, you know, there are reports of issues with stress, anxiety, depression, and so on. But as the research is coming together now, it's also becoming clear that these declines are very specific to specific groups. So people who are young, female, single, separated, or divorced, who had low education levels, negative coping styles, or all already suffered from other issues, those were the ones who really struggled during this time. There are actually also some who got better mental health because they had more time, you know, suddenly more time for leisurely activities, more time to spend with their families and so on. So it's a very kind of broad picture, and that's really important to understand. Since the governments were of course very busy dealing with this urgent health crisis, so coping, psychological coping, was on none of the government's mind, at least during the early days. You know, understandably, I think. So coping became a very individual matter that you had to deal with yourselves, and this is where people turn to, you know, different artistic creative activities like arts and writing, crafts, reading for pleasure, and of course music. But it's important to understand here that, you know, again, there's a specific subset of people who were engaged with music, people who are young, highly educated in this case, socially supported, and especially worried about being infected. So that there's partial overlap with these groups, but not completely. There's, you know, for example, the highly educated versus the opposite up here. So some of the people who turn to music were doing it with a positive mindset. So there are different ways of engaging with music. Is the important part here. So what is corona music, as I call it? So I've kind of coined this term, which deliberately is very, very broad, because I think when we have to study a phenomenon like this, we have to start with a broad lens, and then we can kind of focus a bit later. So we define corona music as the diverse practices of listening to, playing, dancing to, composing, rehearsing, improvising, discussing, exploring, and innovating musical products during lockdown with explicit or implicit reference to the novel coronavirus and or pandemic life circumstances. So like everything counts as corona music a little bit at this stage. And this also goes along with the musicologist Christopher Small, who argues that music should be a verb rather than a noun. Music is something that we do, so we talk about musicking often in musicology, and this is really corona musicking, you could say. Good. So what happened during the early days of the pandemic? Well, we were all, you know, very fascinated with these videos that started turning up on YouTube, and I connected with some of my colleagues on Twitter, and we said, oh, we should do some research on this phenomenon, and that's ultimately within a few weeks led to the establishment of the Global Music COVID Research Network, which I founded together with Melanie Wald-Fuhrmann, who's the director of the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Studies in Frankfurt. And we currently have about 420 members from more than 250 universities and a few companies in 49 countries worldwide. So all the inhabited continents are represented. And you know, we at a stage now where we're trying to figure out, okay, what's going to happen with this network going forward, because you know the attention has turned other places. But at least it's been really good for me to connect with so many different people and with so many different disciplines also, because there are people from from music psychology, there are people from music therapy, there are historical musicologists, ethnomusicologists, data scientists, and so on. Lots of different types of people. And the reason why we wanted to unite our forces here was that we could see that everyone wanted to study, okay, are people listening more to music? Are they playing more? All the same questions that we were all kind of tackling with small local survey studies with limited statistical power. So we thought, okay, if we can join forces, we can avoid some of this redundancy, and we can more quickly move on to the more interesting research questions. And of course, in this way we will improve the scientific quality, and in this way we can better solve societal challenges. So this is kind of the mission of the network. I also had the opportunity to be a member of a focus group established by the Cult Committee of the European Parliament, which looked at how we could, what we should do going forward with the cultural and creative sectors in the EU. How could we kind of learn from this pandemic experience? And we released a report here with some of the recommendations are explained. So it's something about the freelancers don't really have good access to learning during their career. So people needed to learn very quickly new digital skills and new artistic formats and so on. And it's important to ensure going forward, I think that freelancers have access to these kinds of things. That's some of the things we discussed there. Good, and I also established this Frontiers research topic, which is a special issue, very cross-disciplinary, and hosted by Frontiers in Psychology, where we have contributions from Frontiers in Neuroscience and Frontiers in Sociology again, and contributors from all kinds of different fields. We just released the editorial last week, so it's now kind of the final issue with 44 articles from all kinds of different fields. And one of the exciting things here was that Frontiers agreed to take away the requirement that you pay for publishing your work. So we had submissions from parts of the world that are not normally represented in our journals and at our conferences and so on. And that's really exciting, I think.
Could you give an example of this?
Of participation from
yeah.
So I mean, so at music cognition conferences, there are very few people represented from South America, for instance, from the Middle East, from Africa, from large parts of Asia are not represented. But we got some submissions from some of those areas, and also some of the. Of course, I had to say not all the work was of a quality to be published. So it's less diverse than I would have liked it to be at the end. I'd perhaps say, but some of the large-scale multinational survey studies made sure to include people from different South American countries and China and so on, India and so on. So it's the field is moving in that direction, which I think is exciting, and potentially the pandemic may have sped up this movement that was already happening, I think. Yeah. Good. So in our editorial, this is kind of an overview of some of the different methods, some of the different kind of broad topics that were studied, and of course there was a lot of survey studies on engaging with traditional musical repertoires and formats, but also there's some work on new formats, live stream concerts and so on, virtual choirs and so on, and music education, music therapy, and the life circumstances of musicians and so on. And it's hard to conduct experiments in the lockdown, but I think we're getting better and better at doing that also, which is exciting. Good. So and in terms of covering the time span of the pandemic, it's these are all the survey studies that cover different parts of the pandemic. It's important to realize that the lockdown stringency changed during this time, and we had very little data regarding the first part of the lockdown, where most of the interesting music videos and so on actually happened in February here, but we don't really have much data from February and March. So it's kind of as suggesting that we should make sure that we have the infrastructure for reacting promptly as researchers, collecting data straight away whenever a new crisis hits. So that's something to have at the back of our minds, so we're better prepared the next time. Good. Okay, so that lot of talk about context and not so much research yet. But I would just mention also that being a music COVID researcher, I've been the media were very interested in talking to us, especially during the early times of the pandemic, and they wanted the answers to all those questions. Are people using it more? Are people listening more to nostalgic music? And we just say, okay, we could only say, oh, there are these anecdotal observations, but like we don't really have the data yet. Now we do have the data, and now it's a bit harder to engage with journalists because they've kind of moved on. So there's this kind of offset between when the journalists are interested in talking to us and when we actually have something to talk about that is properly based in actual research. So this is something where maybe we can educate journalists and the general public in the slowness of research and the process. Good. So I've also had the opportunity to write the first 3 literature reviews on the field as a whole, and that's some of the things that I'll talk about today. There are all book chapters that will come out later this year, hopefully. They're available on Sci Archive if you're interested. Good. So getting to the actual research. Here's a timeline with the pandemic declaration on the 11th of March. I've here plotted the Oxford Stringency Index from 186 countries, and this is the average here. So you can see, most countries are generally following this, but there's a lot of individual variability between the countries. We don't have longitudinal data that kind of precedes the pandemic declaration, but we can see when people started collecting data, we can see that depressive symptoms are in the mild depression range and were decreasing throughout lockdown, and maybe relates to the decrease in stringency as well. It's hard to say. The interest in corona music is relevant here if we want to study this phenomenon, and we can see if we do a Google Trends search, we can see that it really peaked here between the 1st of March and the 1st of May or June perhaps, and then it kind of came back to low levels. So most of the musical innovation really happened during this early time, and most of the attention to musical innovations was during this time. So this makes it even more important to have data from this early period. These 3 months, essentially. Good. So what do we know about music listening during this time? Well, we can collect both objective data from streaming services, and we can ask people how much did you listen to music and so on. So these are 2 different data types. And when we look at the more objective streaming data, we see that consumption of music actually decreased after the pandemic declaration quite dramatically. But of course, again, there are lots of differences, a lot more in the Philippines than in Denmark, for instance. And this comes back to the fact that we can predict these differences very clearly with reference to changes in commuting and mobility, and also lockdown restrictions and so on. So if when people were not commuting anymore, they were consuming less music. When people were not going to the gym to exercise, they were consuming less music during this time. Yeah.
Quick question. By pandemic declaration, you mean the WHO?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have and the x-axis there is?
Week of the year.
That's
a little bit odd. I mean, the year is clearly starting at a different point. I don't know exactly what's up here, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's in February.
The pandemic declaration is on the 11th of March.
11th of March.
Yeah. So just the day when Denmark was shut down as well.
Yes, the same day.
Yeah. Good. If we look at YouTube, for instance, this was Spotify at the top here. If we look at YouTube, on the other hand, there's actually an increase in consumption. So it seems like people were migrating from these audio only to the more kind of video-based platforms that also better facilitate participation with music, such as YouTube. Good. So when we then ask people in self-report studies, how much did you listen to music during this time? Most people report that they listen more to music during lockdown than before. So this seems to be, either it's explained by this migration towards YouTube, or people are not really completely aware of their quantity of consumption during this time. But there's again a lot of individual variability, even in the ones that report mostly increases in activities. There's a lot of people who report decreases as well. And of course, there are obviously lots of other increases for many other domestic activities. People also cooked more, people cleaned more, and those kinds of things. And singing and dancing, for instance, were rated as some of the most efficient ways of coping. Just as efficient as listening, but of course you couldn't go out to dance during this time. You couldn't sing with your usual choir and so on, but you could listen to music, and you might have done it in a more participatory way because you couldn't do those other things. So there's some questions here about are there some qualitatively different ways of engaging with music, the different attention levels, different individual differences, different motivations, different repertoires, and so on. That's really some of the interesting questions that some of the survey studies can get at. And we have a big one here, which is one of the two biggest studies on this phenomenon. It's also the earliest one of these two, data collected already during April and May. We have about 5,000 respondents once we've cleaned the data from France, Germany, India, Italy, the UK, and New York City. And what we did is we had a huge questionnaire. We did some exploratory factor analysis, and our main analysis was this light gradient boosting machine models, where we were predicting the extent to which people were socially, emotionally benefiting from music from all the different variables that we had to try to figure out what the mechanisms might be. And there's an acquiescence bias in this kind of data. So in India, people just have a tendency to respond more positively when they take part in a survey like this. So we had to kind of rank the responses within countries. Good. So first, looking at some descriptive data, what did people, what kind of domestic activities were people engaged in? Everything that's right of this line are reported increases in activities. So most activities, as I said before, increased. People were calling people more, cleaning, cooking, as I said, watching the news and so on. But also listening to music and making music are relatively high on this list. When people listen to music, they tend to do it alone. They tend to do it, maybe when they're doing housework, but also when they're doing nothing else. So, music was perhaps consumed with more attention potentially. When people made music, it was also at home, obviously. There was some singing, there was some dancing, but also via the internet. It was a common way of making music. Then when we asked people, how did your motivations for engaging with music, for making music and listening to music change during this time, the highest ranking, the motivations that changed the most, you could say, were all ones that related to emotion regulation. So helps you relax, energizes you, puts you in a good mood, it's enjoyable, and so on. Those are really the functions that people engaged more in during this time, when you ask themselves. Then to the main analysis here, where we find that the factor that most strongly predicts the extent to which people benefited from music is their interest in the corona-specific repertoires. So it seems like the people who were into all this balcony singing and making music with others online and finding the newest videos and so on, those were the ones who benefited the most from music, which suggests that maybe there's something special about this repertoire. But of course there are other effects as well here, and the factor analysis also shows something interesting here, that there was kind of as I call it, a bifurcation between people who were in a positive mood and a negative mood. And the people who were in a positive mood, they used music as a replacement for social interaction, whereas the people who were in a negative mood, they used music for more kind of inward-directed social, solitary emotional regulation. So there seems to be two different ways overall of engaging with music during this time, and they vary with your mood. A little bit slow, this one. Okay. Of course, there are other studies apart from ours. We know that at least half of the population engaged with music for coping. We know that music is rated as the most effective activity for achieving well-being goals. In some studies, it's outperforming things like watching TV, serious movies, reading, physical exercise, changing location, those kinds of things. And we know that life satisfaction correlates positively with music listening, but negatively with watching TV. And of course, here there might be a conflation between watching Netflix and watching news. But it seems like people who were watching a lot of TV felt had lower life satisfaction than people who engage with music. It also seems like perceived importance of music played a role. So the people who were already engaging with music before were also the ones for whom music engagement was most effective. So it seems like if people are musically literate, they can benefit from music more when they're faced with a crisis.
Is the causality clear there, or is it that people watch more TV when they're sad?
Yeah, I mean it's all it's all correlational, so it's really hard to say. We don't know about the causality. We don't know about the causality.
Just out of curiosity, the COWS study on life satisfaction, did that also include exercise and that stuff as the previous one, the blood one? I mean, it's surprising that it would, outperform exercise.
Yeah,
and
but it really did in some of the studies. I don't remember if it was this specific one or if some of the others. But yeah. But again, I mean, you can also say, is there kind of a selection bias? Are the people who do a survey on music the ones who are already, more interested in music and so on? So it's really hard. This is really quite messy data. In terms of what people listen to, we know that about a quarter to half of the people, it's really not responding very well, quarter to half of the people explored new styles and artists, but also an even higher proportion of people listen to nostalgic music. So there are both of these things going on at the same time. And that's a really cool study with the 17 trillion Spotify plays, where they operationalize nostalgic music as any music that's older than 3 years. And actually listening to this music went up during this time. So that's interesting. And then of course the corona music that I alluded to before was really prominent. More than half self-reported a moderate to extreme interest in corona music. A very high proportion of Israelis listen to corona music. Half of Spaniards engaged in corona music, and people also consume live-streamed music more during this time.
Could I just ask Niels about the exercise thing? Denmark, it was possible to go outside and physically, and UK and Ireland and other countries, you were physically allowed to go outside once. Is there any difference across countries in, say, music was accessible and available to people, but not physical activity?
Yeah. I mean,
I'm so surprised at that finding.
Yeah. I mean, I would assume there are differences there, but again, it's really hard to I would have to look into the specific subsets of the data. I don't recall.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I guess there must be many little things like this.
Yeah, they're pretty.
Between all the countries that it's bound to be this or that. It's this larger
Right.
scale.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the plot you saw before with all the different, from the special issue with all the different lines, also showed that, you know, one survey could include countries that are very low lockdown stringency, and while they're also including countries that are very high at different times, and, you know, so yeah, it's a little bit hard to interpret everything. But of course, as I said, Corona music seems to play a special role. And that's, we're then lucky that I launched this Corona music database, crowdsourced database during the early days of the pandemic, where I invited people to submit examples of Corona music videos, however they defined it really. First by Google Sheets and then on Survey Exacts. And we then afterwards did retrospective sampling, where we kind of reproduced our existing cultural bias by sampling at least 5 videos per day during this important early periods during Google searches on YouTube. So we made sure that we had some representation here, and then we manually coded all of these videos with 2 coders. You know, we coded some basic information about what was the language, the lyrics, where did it come from, what was the platform, but also some, you know, things about, you know, what was the setting, the genre, the emotion. Were people making music together? Was it an original song, original lyrics? Did they allude to health or conflict, physical movement, and so on?
So I missed it. The retrospective sampling. So people were asked in the survey to think back.
No. This is, you know, first we did the crowdsourced sample where people submitted. Yeah. And then once we had our crowdsourced sample, several months later, we searched on Google within these specific time spans, you know, with a number of keywords, and to make sure that we had at least 5 Corona-related music videos during this time. So it was not, it was kind of, Google searches.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So we have a relatively good representation here over time during this critical periods. So this is, you know, crowdsourced data and then retrospective data in yellow. We also sample media reports during this time. And, you know, as I said, we have cultural biases, so like huge representation of the US, Denmark, the UK, Italy, Israel, Australia, and so on. Certain other countries that are less represented, but we do have some entries from different parts of the world. Good, and we have this cool shiny app that Danish Yearbook designed, where you can access all the data and play around with it, focus in on your preferred country, and so on. Good. So looking at some descriptives, which is, you know, we only have descriptives here since it's a database. We see some interesting things here in terms of emotions, that positive emotions like, you know, togetherness, being moved, but also happiness, hope, humor, and so on seem to be very prominent in this data. People were usually making music at home, unsurprisingly, not so much at music studios and venues. Balcony concerts were perhaps less prominent than you would have thought if you just follow the news. And, you know, people made a lot of music outside and online and so on as well. A huge bias towards English language, of course, here, and but the genres, musical genres that were represented correspond very closely to what an average North American listener would listen to, according to other studies.
In this database, so does that mean it was mainly North American-ish?
Music, people? No, not completely, but there's definitely an over-representation. And I mean, the music that we listen to is not so far from what they listen to in North America. So, you know, there are big parts of the world where we all kind of listen to the same type of music, and we sing in English even though we're not based in an English-speaking country and so on.
And probably even if there are people from China who join in, that would be the segment in China who probably more likely to listen to this music anyway.
Yes.
I would imagine.
Yeah, and of course, you know, I was sampling via social media and so on. So, you know, like, there's a huge issues there, but at least we have a sample of music here. And so I actually put a playlist on YouTube, the Corona music playlist, where I've kind of curated I think 14 different videos that represent the different genres or types of corona music, and there are some descriptions there that you can read if you can find them. They're very difficult to find, but they exist. Or send me an email if you want kind of the narrative between the different types of music. I thought if we have a bit of time, we could maybe listen to some very short excerpts. But my qualitative analysis of this corona music kind of points to different characteristics of the music. So there's a tendency for, as I talked about, people engaging actively, multimodally, with a lot of attention, and creatively. There's a focus on here and now, and reproducing kind of liveness, but also informality, authenticity, intimacy. So you get the famous celebrities invite you into their own living room. They wear kind of normal clothes and so on. Music is something you make together very much. Amateurs are involved as well. Co-creation. The sentiments are quite positive and potentially positively biased because it was a serious crisis we were in. There's a lot of humor, hope, resilience songs where you're kind of saying we can make this together. And the topics that corona music typically deals with are kind of somewhat simplistic or trivial. So there's a lot of talk about I'm running out of toilet paper and those kinds of things. So that there's something when you're faced in a crisis, you kind of turn inwards and focus on your own needs, but doing so in a very kind of humoristic and positive way, because you're maybe not personally under threat yourself at any given time. So here is here is a video, actually from a Danish group. So from Aarhus, alumni from the St. Clemens Danes Grammar School Boys Choir, affiliated with Aarhus Cathedral, who were based on Rasmus Seebach's Øde pop song, received more than 1.5 million plays on Facebook with this kind of a funny song. We just hear the beginning, if I can figure that out. For those of it appears to we're together about this, but also talk about washing hands and toilet paper and so on. Good. So it kind of ticks some of these boxes, and it's important to say this is also an example of the virtual choirs, these split screen choirs, where people have a click track that they listen to, they record their own video, and someone puts it all together and gives this illusion of collective music making. Which is a genre that existed before the pandemic, but really peaked during this time. Of course, during the early days when the pandemic was affecting Italy a lot, there was a lot of solidarity with Italy, and this song, Bella Ciao, it became very popular. It was originally sung during the late 19th century by seasonal workers protesting against harsh working conditions in the North Italian rice fields, and subsequently it was revived by the anti-fascist resistance during the Second World War, and then it became kind of a popular song again.
Christian,
yeah.
Could I get you to turn the speakers down again? There's I had to mute you on Zoom. And they're asking, we can't hear him anymore.
Okay, but there won't be any music now, will there?
Oh, you're playing one more. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just play a little bit.
Yeah.
That's okay.
So you completely lost the political ability outside?
Yeah, it did, because it was kind of happening a lot before the whole kind of protest against masks or vaccines or something. So I don't think it really intersected with that kind of thing. It was you know, a message of it became viral, and it's sometimes hard to understand where that virality is coming from, I think.
There was a TV series.
Was it?
Yeah, which had that song very prominently.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's a very popular song, so it's still, I think it still retains the social bonding aspect of it.
Yeah. Ooh.
Sorry.
This feels such a long time ago.
And you can see that everyone is taking part, regardless whether they're good musicians or not. It's not really in time. This is great. It comes down.
That would be me. I don't.
That's kind of that. So yeah, really cool. Again, it ticks a lot of the boxes here.
Do you have more video
Just
clips?
one more, I
All right.
promise. It's the last one. So this is a Rotterdam Philharmonic Orchestra, which was one of the first classical orchestras who tried to produce these videos, split-screen videos with a light-hearted call for unity and resilience during this difficult time. And after them, a lot of other orchestras did the same. And what's interesting to note here is that typically when you go to a classical concert, you go to the concert hall, everyone is wearing, you know, very, very fancy clothes. They all look the same, have the same color. Every single musician doesn't really have, you know, much to say on their own. This is really the reverse. Everyone is at their home wearing whatever they feel like, with whatever political messages or whatever they had. They all introduce themselves at the beginning. So it takes like a minute just introducing themselves before the actual music starts. So it's kind of, you know, completely reversing the classical orchestra tradition. I think, at least. Can agree or disagree?
It's very common, wasn't it?
Hallo allemaal, ik ben Pierre Wijzer en ik speel hoorn in het Rotterdamse Philharmonisch Orkest.
Mijn naam is Maria Dinjan,
Jan Jansen,
Anja van der Maat,
Juliana Sommerhouder,
Kamerheid Samson,
André Stukker.
Simon Wierenga en ik speel trompet.
En die delegaat.
Arjen Leenders.
They have this appeal for unity in the moment. We can do it if we just stick together.
Pieter Neutel.
Ik ben Saskia.
En ik ben Wim.
Wij spelen in het Rotterdamse Philharmonisch Orkest.
We moeten ons aanpassen aan een nieuwe werkelijkheid.
En oplossingen vinden om elkaar te steunen. Creatieve krachten helpen ons hierbij.
Laten we out of the box denken.
En innovatie gebruiken.
Om het samen te doen en onze bond met elkaar te blijven voeren. Als we het samen doen, gaan we ons lukken.
And then you might know Beethoven's Ode to Joy. I'll be jumping a little bit because it's and then it kind of, you know, grows. Okay, let's move on. Okay,
Yes,
so these
question,
yeah.
just for the people
Oh,
online,
yeah,
they've been patient, waiting
They don't know.
on mute. Okay. Good.
Good. Okay, so yes, I alluded to a bit of potentially what I call positivity bias in this kind of music. We know that positive affect and humor are linked with resilience. We know that it can effectively reduce anxiety. So is this positive affective bias potentially part of the coping mechanisms during this time? Does this trend hold true if we focus on a larger data set than these kind of this coronamusic database with all its limitations and potential biases?
Is it a bias when it's like a choice?
Well, I mean, you can discuss what's the best term there, but I guess my point is that the health crisis was a very serious crisis. There were people dying. We were struggling in many different ways, and it seems like people are just making fun of it. The corona music is why is your lack of toilet paper so important when people are dying and so on. So there's some kind of a contrast there, but if you have a better idea for a term, I'm open to that. Yeah.
Well, I guess it was toilet paper was a bigger issue for most people than people dying.
Yeah, but all the people singing they have no toilet paper have a whole cupboard full of toilet paper. So they're not really struggling, even though they think it's fun to kind of make fun of this a little bit, right? Yeah, something interesting going on. So this is where the social media data comes into place. So this is the work from the last seed funding grant, I guess, where we try to quantify kind of sentiment or valence in different ways. With Spotify API has an audio feature called valence. The natural language toolkit has different tools that are performing better or worse for social media and news media for these kinds of data sets. So I'll go through some of the data sets, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but I'm eating a bit into the discussion probably.
That's nice.
Yeah, good. So the Spotify first, we identified about 10,000 Corona themed playlists, and we focused on the playlists that had at least one follower, so not just something that no one listened to. We identified that with different keywords that we found in different ways, and then we had a control data set, which is widely known in the literature. It's called music streaming sessions data set, which is supposed to be kind of representative of what people listened to on Spotify a few years ago. Then the Spotify API has these audio features where it kind of qualifies different things, valence, which is useful for us, but also tempo, mode, loudness, energy, danceability, acousticness, liveness, speechiness, all kinds of vague things that, because it's a black box, we can't really know how they computed these things, so we can try to go back to old conference proceedings and kind of reconstruct where they're coming from, but we don't really know how they get at these things. But they're still used in research, but just be aware of that. So when we quantify the valence of the corona music versus the non-corona music, it's slightly higher and statistically significantly so in valence. So corona music is more positive than average listening. But what we find quite interesting when we perform k-means clustering on all of these audio features is that there tends to be two kind of overall clusters of corona music. So one is the zero, the blue one here, high on acousticness, low on energy, tempo, danceability, and so on. It's kind of a here are some a word cloud from the titles of these playlists. It's kind of chill corona music, home, lo-fi, and so on. And then we have the cluster one here, which is high energy party corona music. So again, kind of a bifurcation of two different types of corona music. And when we split it out up into these two clusters, we see that the positive cluster is even more positive than general corona music, and the negative cluster is even more negative than listening. So there seems to be some evidence for some kind of bifurcation here.
So the chill music is also negative?
Yeah. And of course, then you can discuss, okay, what is this valence? But it's derived from acoustic features. It's probably, Yeah, and I mean, presumably it's independent from tempo and mode and those kinds of things, but there's something in music that makes it kind of sad, perhaps, or something like that. Yeah. So with the Twitter data set, we have about 16 million non-musical tweets and 140,000 music-related tweets in English that we sampled from a data set, which is really cool because here you have location data for all the different tweets. We see that the music tweets overall exhibited more positive sentiment than the non-music tweets. And you see some peaks here which are due to retweets, but even when you remove the retweets, the musical tweets are also more positive than the non-musical ones during this time. And this is both attributed to more positive and less negative sentiment, if that makes sense. So sentiment here is on a scale from -1 to 1. We then, currently working a bit and speculating on how best to do that. Trying to kind of relate to track the positivity or negativity bias over time during this time. And so red is negativity bias, green is positivity bias. So maybe there's something happening here where it starts out with a negativity bias. You see China, India, Australia, Iran, I think it's Turkey, whatever it is, and then it turns positive, and there seems to be a tendency for positivity bias here. We did some reanalysis of this with birds, which is supposed to be more context sensitive and perhaps able to pick up some of these this kind of sarcasm and irony, which is all over the place here. And what we see again here is that music-related tweets tend to have more positive and less negative sentiment than non-music-related tweets, and it's maybe driven by things like joy and decreases in fear and so on. And a very cool finding, I think, is that the positivity bias actually increases with greater lockdown stringency. So it seems like the more you're kind of constrained to your own to your own house, the more you kind of bias your music making and music consumption towards positive. Oh well, this is Twitter, so I'm maybe generalizing a little bit, but the more positively you write about music compared to general news during this time.
Can you that's just clarification for me?
Yeah.
Can you just remind me when you say positivity bias?
Yeah.
Do you mean that there's more positive sentiment
In the music-related tweets compared to the non-music-related tweets?
Okay.
Yeah. Good. So for Reddit, we zoomed in on two subreddits, one called Let's Talk Music and one called Listen to This, during March to May 2020, and then as our controls, the same months, same subreddits during the previous year. And here we see, interestingly, for the Let's Talk Music, yes, there's a positive affective bias. Sentiment increases from 2020 to 2019, but we see the opposite effect, and also quite strongly in the Listen to This subreddit. So if I were to speculate about what this means, I think it could relate to this bifurcation again, that the people in a positive mood might go towards this Let's Talk Music, where you're participating, discussing back and forth with other people about music. People who want music for internal self-regulation go to the Listen to This subreddit, where they get advice about you should go home and listen to this on your own. So it seems like, again, potentially a bifurcation, but perhaps less strong evidence.
What's the scale here, or the effect size? Because the difference is significant, but it's really small, so I'm thinking, okay, the sample is very large, so it can easily happen that even small differences can become significant, but that doesn't really mean that they're different.
No. I know what you mean. So I mean, yeah, here you have the effect size. It's not a lot. I think again this is quite noisy data, and I'm a little bit hesitant about how to interpret it. But it is kind of interesting that they seem to go in very different directions, and it's not it's not that you know, I think this is a relatively large effect potentially, but yeah, definitely something to be yeah.
So we think that the solitary emotion regulation music is also the chill and lower valence music.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe people listen to sad music to deal with the fact that they're sad.
Yeah, yeah. That's a typical behavior that we see also outside of pandemic times. People actually, you know, really enjoy listening to sad music.
Yeah.
Good. So for YouTube, we looked at the YouTube videos from the Corona Music database, and then we saw for each of those videos, are they on different playlists on YouTube? And then we looked at those Corona themed playlists to kind of increase our sample. And we have a lot more than 329 videos, but 329 were the one where we were able to match each of the Corona music videos to a non-Corona music videos published by the same user, with approximately the same number of comments and number of views and so on. So we try to kind of match sample of Corona music versus non-Corona music. And then we looked at the comments and identified and quantified the sentiment. Here's just some word clouds about comments. So typically in normal times, there's a lot of discussion about liking and loving music, so on. During lockdown, there was a lot of focus on gratitude, stay home, and so on. And we see something, like a tendency here for the Corona music comments to be more positive than controls, but not really. And the same here, I guess. So yeah, just splitting it up in positive, neutral, and negative sentiment. So this is not a not a strong effect, and probably not even an effect. So there's some issues with the matching here potentially. So there are some new Corona-specific channels on YouTube. There were some non-music related channels that suddenly started showing music. There were some old channels that were revived and so on. So it's really, I'm not sure how much you can really get out of this. It's very, very messy. Finally, the new news corpus, so news on the web, now corpus, which has news articles published during the pandemic, but also before that. So here we looked at music-related articles from 2020 versus 2019, and we had a further control with non-music-related articles from 2020 matched on the publication date and news source. So we kind of have two controls here. We process the data as you do. And this is how it looks. So there is, a tendency again for music sentiment to be higher than non-music sentiment. So we think, okay, this is an interesting effect. But when we take into account our other control, we actually see that this difference, this positive sentiment was positive bias. Was even larger in 2019. So it seems like both general news sentiment and music-related news sentiment increased during Corona times, which is, a little bit surprising. But there are other studies that show similar things actually. So it seems like that non-music increased more than music did, and then you end up with something that's not statistically significant anymore. So probably also not very strong evidence for what we're looking for. Yeah, and there's some issues with sampling, matching again. Okay, so just to conclude before we end, we see a small to moderate positive affective bias in Corona musicking online. It seems to be geographically widespread. We see it in different countries. It increases with lockdown stringency, so it's exciting, I think. And the news sentiment may have, general news sentiment may have increased as well. And then there seems to be some evidence for the stylistic bifurcation between energetic party Corona music, which is a participatory communal activity, and sad chill Corona music, which is more of a solitary thing. There are some methodological challenges. We'll come back to that. So, you know, the conclusion from this part of the work would be that positively biased coronamusic may have caused short-term mental health benefits through anxiety reduction and emotion regulation, and this may have facilitated problem-oriented long-term coping. But of course, you know, it's hard to say that, you know, it's hard to prove these things, but this is kind of one interpretation of the data. So conclude more broadly, music played a very significant role in early pandemic coping. It worked at least as well as many other leisure activities. It's true for a diverse cultural sample, and music provided both individual mood regulation and collective cohesion, and these distinct functions seem to be associated with negative and positive emotions. Corona-themed music was widely created and consumed, and it was associated with enhanced coping through music. So is it possible that this topically tailored, as I call it, musical repertoire such as corona music could constitute an adaptive function for tackling societal and existential crises throughout human history and evolution? So this is kind of the speculative proposal that arises from these kinds of findings, and could potentially pave the way for more research on, but also like just political and cultural practice, but like research on what is the role of music during a societal crisis. And I think if I were to speculate a little bit about this, I would say that during this crisis, the citizens have, you know, they've done musical coping on their own. It's been a very kind of bottom-up process on social media, which, you know, modern technology makes this possible, essentially. Society was focused on both, you know, fighting the health crisis, but also, you know, things like providing financial support programs for musicians, for instance, who were unemployed during this time. So the next time there's a crisis, you could think about, is there a way of stimulating this musical coping in ways in which, instead of, you know, just transferring money to musicians, you could pay them to kind of assist with this coping process. So, you know, here's a couple of examples. You know, music could play a role in telemedicine. You can have musical apps, public health information. There are some examples of that. Could commission works, have composers in residence. You could pay musical visits to the lonely or elderly. You could have music in the virtual classroom. You could curate concerts and so on. So, you know, kind of a suggestion that the next time there's a crisis, why don't we think about how music can be used to deal with this crisis. Good. So with that, I'll just say thank you to IMC and my other the people who employed me, and the teams for the three kind of overall strands of research: the survey study, the corona music database, and more locally here in Aarhus, the social media research. Thank you.